Welcome to Thank You for Your Service, Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. My name is Tom Heiser, and I will be your host. Today is my pleasure to be talking with Brigadier General Mark Anderson from Wisconsin Rapids, who is currently the Deputy Adjutant General of the Army in the state of Wisconsin. Thank you for your service, General.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you. You're from Rapids.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Tell us about your early life growing up in Rapids, where you went to school and things like that, please.
Okay. You know, I was very blessed, obviously, to grow up in this community. Born and raised. My father was a Navy veteran from World War II. My mother worked at a local paint store, Mott's Paint, if you might remember that. Mm-hmm. And growing up, you know, I had, I would call it a fairly idyllic childhood. You know, I enjoyed playing sports and kick the can and all the other various activities I think that young boys did at that time. Took part in the local swimming pool, you know, all the other, those activities that kept me physically busy. And, you know, and as I kind of grew up, I went to house school for kindergarten, Saints Peter and Paul, for my elementary, and then ultimately graduated from Assumption High School. But during that time, you know, I had a lot of friends and a lot of neighbors that had, I think, a similar experience like I did, and you know, we played together, and you know, used to play war when we were young, and you know, I think it probably rubbed off on me ultimately.
So you graduated from high school. Where'd you go to college?
So I graduated from high school. I went to UW-Stevens Point. I majored. I had a very keen interest in the outdoors, natural resources, waters in particular, water resources. So Stevens Point was a natural draw. I mean, the College of Natural Resources is nationally known as one of the finest natural resources colleges. So you know, and it was local, which was nice, obviously, but that was not my intent. The focus was more on the quality of the academics. And so went to UW-Stevens Point, was up there my first year in the dorms, like most college freshmen. And after that, I really commuted back and forth. Regrettably, during that time, my father passed away. And so I really was, you know, I had to pay my way through college. And so I worked in addition to going through college simultaneously.
ROTC program in Point? Were you a member of that?
I was not. You know, when I joined, or when I went to UWSP, the military science program there did have, they've got 4 levels, what they call MS1 all through MS4. Mm-hmm. And the first 2 are really geared towards an opportunity for individuals, if they have an interest in ROTC, to get some exposure. But they also provide physical education credits, so 1 credit necessary in college. And so I took MS1 and MS2 more for the strict purpose of the physical education. But, you know, again, looking back now, I'm thinking, of course, I must have had a draw or an interest in the ROTC program or the military in general. Otherwise, I probably would have just taken some standard Phi-Ed classes.
Exactly. So you're in college. Did you enlist while you were in college, or was that after you got out of college you enlisted?
No, I enlisted when I was in college, January of 1983. So I was in between my second and my third year of college. And I'm not sure what the bug was. You know, I told you, I mentioned my father was in World War II. He was in the Navy. As I was growing up, my brother was returning from Vietnam. He went there and went to Vietnam in 1970 and 71. And so I had some family connections of service in the military. And I think it just stuck with me. And so when I was in college, obviously I was looking for ways to continue to supplement my income. But something, rose up in my mind that I should look at the Army or look at the military. The Army was a natural draw because that's what my brother was in Vietnam. And so I just walked down to the local recruiter, and it was probably the easiest recruit he ever had. And so, I went and talked to him, took the test to see what I, was eligible for. I could have chosen anything I wanted to. I decided to stay local. There was a local reserve unit up in Junction City that was Signal, and communications did interest me, so I joined as a Signal, radio teletype operator.
Okay, so did anybody else go in with you, or did you go in all by yourself and enlisted?
No, I went in all by myself. It was, there were my other friends. I had a neighbor that actually joined. He was a year older than me. He joined going right out of high school, went into the Navy, and he ended up serving his term on an aircraft carrier. But nobody else came along with me, so when I ultimately left for basic training, it was Mark Anderson by himself and going to basic and AIT all together, which was a great experience.
So when you went in and enlisted, what did you think it was going to be like?
You know, right after I joined, I talked to my brother to get a sense of what he experienced. Of course, he joined and he went through basic training, a completely different time period than what I did. It was during the draft for Tom. For myself, we had converted to an all-volunteer force, and so while the rigors of basic training was no different than what Tom had explained to me, and so I knew what to expect. At least I had a sense of what to expect. Of course, there were things that kind of threw a curveball at me, but I mean, I was very blessed. Again, while in high school, I wrestled, so I was extremely physically fit. I did a lot of running, and so going off to basic training, it really never was an issue for the physical fitness piece. And of course, I was a little bit older than 18. I was close to 20, and so I was a little more mature than the other recruits that were in the basic training class or company with myself. In fact, that I think it showed when I got there. Week 2, I earned my stripes as I was the squad leader, and kept my stripes throughout the entire basic training period, which is kind of unique because usually you lose those sometime.
Where was basic?
So I went to Fort McClellan, Alabama. It's no longer open anymore. It's closed down. It used to be the base or the post, I should say, where they would train not only basic trainees, but then future military police and soldiers that were going in as chemical. And those are neither of my two areas, obviously. So when I got done with Fort McClellan, I then transferred over to Fort Gordon, Georgia, which is the signal school, still is, and then started learning my skills as a radio teletype operator. Fort McClellan was, is an interesting place. Of course, deep south Alabama, and I said I joined in January of 1983, but I didn't ship until after the end of the semester. So I actually shipped in July of 1983. Of course, much hotter in Alabama than it was up here at the time, and so for a Wisconsin boy to be thrust into basic training in the middle of the summer was kind of unique. We were doing PT like most folks in the military. We were doing PT at 3:30, 4 in the morning, but it was still 85, 90 degrees. Mm-hmm. So it was extremely hot. That's probably the biggest experience I recall from basic training, aside from some of the some of the basic soldier skills, just the oppressive heat and the humidity.
So even though you were in the reserves at that time, you still trained with the regular Army basic
Yes.
recruits?
Correct, yeah. Our class was composed of both Army Reserve, National Guard, and active duty. No different standard with regards to the type of training for basic training or the type of training for your advanced individual training, what we call AIT.
Right. So you finished basic. Now you're going on to AIT.
Mm-hmm.
A little different?
It was. It was, I don't want to say, I would never call it a gentleman's course. That would be probably a little too extreme. We still had not necessarily drill sergeants, but we had obviously our platoon sergeants, and was living out of 30-man Quonset huts, and so it was, it was just another experience than what I had received at Fort McClellan. The training pretty much was consistent, from 06 in the morning all the way until about 1800 at night, eating dinner and then doing whatever you needed to do in the evening hours to study and prepare for the technical training we were receiving, in addition to preparing your own area for inspections and such.
So this whole time that you're in basic and you're in AIT, you're not in college. You had to take a semester off?
I skipped a semester of college, yes. Yeah. It was a commitment. It was a conscious decision that I made. I wanted to get the training completed, knowing I was going to have to skip a semester. But I wanted to get the training completed so that when I came back, I could serve with the unit that I was assigned to, and just continue on with my college career uninterrupted. With having to, if I would have split it, I would have had to go back, the next summer, and I just didn't want to do that.
Okay, radio teletype operator.
Right.
Junction City. How long were you with that unit?
I was only with them for about 7 months. I arrived, and good folks, and a lot of folks from the Wisconsin Rapids area, Junction City, Stevens Point area, pretty much the surrounding communities and small towns made up that unit. I discovered that I just wasn't as happy with the type of training that we were doing, and so I started talking to friends, here in Wisconsin Rapids, and one of my friends, commented to me that there was a local National Guard unit here in Wisconsin Rapids, and I should check them out. And so I drove down to the local armory that's still here on 2nd Avenue, and walked in to the recruiter's office, and like I said, it was probably the best or the easiest recruit he ever had, because I was already trained, had gone through basic and AIT. They had the exact same MOS that I was, and so it was an easy fit. And so as soon as I got done talking to him, I decided to transfer to the National Guard.
So you just literally transferred over. Rank came with you and everything.
Correct. Yeah, I was, because of my college experience up to that point, the number of credits I had when I joined, I was actually immediately promoted to private first class. So I can't really say I enjoyed that rank, because there are not a lot of differences between a PV1, PV2, PV3. But it was a little bit extra pay, probably, I don't remember the difference at this point, probably $6 a month, I'm guessing. But yes, the rank and everything transferred right with it.
Okay, so you're now with the 120th Field Artillery.
Correct.
Here in Rapids. PFC.
PFC Anderson. Yeah, I was with them for quite a bit of my career, but I started out enlisted again, and the battery commander at that time was Captain Dan Joling, and some people in the community may know Dan. He used to be the police officer up in Nakusa, ultimately the police chief there, and then transferred up as the police chief up in Weston. And Dan, I can say that now because obviously him and we're actually very good friends. But Dan and I think saw something in me, some character, some skills that I think he recognized the potential in me. And so he approached me about becoming an officer, and explained to me the differences, the challenges, the responsibilities associated with becoming an officer versus staying enlisted. And so I decided to take a look at the program. I liked what I saw, and so I signed up for Officer Candidate School, or OCS as we refer to it.
Okay, are you still going to school when you go into OCS, or had you since graduated and now are working somewhere? Or?
No, I was just finishing up my college, and so I was about a year out, and the OCS program that I went to, I should say, is through the Wisconsin National Guard. We still have the exact same program. It's the program of instruction that you receive is exact same or same type of training and instruction that you receive at Fort Benning. So I chose to stay here in the state. It went through a series of months, ended up being about 14 months in total. As soon as I graduated from WMA, the Wisconsin Military Academy, in the Officer Candidate School program, I commissioned a second lieutenant, and it just about coincided. It actually did coincide with my graduation from college. I graduated in May of 1986 from UW-Stevens Point, and I pinned a second lieutenant in August of 1986.
Okay, so you're still part-time military.
Correct.
And you're working in the community?
I was. Well, I graduated from college, and like all college graduates, I was looking for a job, and of course trying to find something in my field. I had some challenges with that, and so I was looking, really throughout the region. At that point, I had met now my wife, and her and I were actually engaged, And so I really wanted to stay as local as I could, or in the Wisconsin area. Had some challenges, again, finding anything associated with water resources, but I was able to find an opportunity. During my summer vacation, or my summer months, I was working as a summer vacation relief for Consolidated Papers. So I got some experience there. As fate would have it, so in 1986, I'm working in the summer at Consolidated Papers, and with the intent of, at the end of the summer, I would be departing and continue my job search. They offered me a full-time job. And so I transitioned from a temporary or a summer vacation employee into a full-time employee for Consolidated Papers. I saw it as obviously a source of income, but also an opportunity to start to see where I could investigate working for Consolidated connected to my background. And ultimately I had some opportunities.
Okay. And what were some of those opportunities that you did have and took advantage of?
Sure. So, I worked with Consolidated and then ultimately Stora Enso, New Page, for over 20 years. During that time, I started working in what was paperboard, and so I was a union employee, and I worked on the line. Actually ran one of their core machines, producing paper cores. I did that for about a year and a half. And during that time, I went off to my officer basic course down at Fort Sill, because now I was commissioned as a field artillery officer. I wasn't signal. And concurrent with that, I started talking to various supervisors and managers within the company on opportunities in Consolidated that kind of aligned with my degree. And I discovered that Consolidated Papers had a utility, a Consolidated Water Power Company. And in addition, they had a quality systems program that did a lot of testing or calibration of the lab equipment that was located throughout the entire company. So I started focusing some of my attentions in that direction. I had the great opportunity to sit down with Mr. Roy Schultz at that time. I don't know if you remember Roy. He ultimately retired as a senior vice president for the company. But Roy was the mill manager for Wisconsin Rapids Mill at that point. Had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him about how my background might fit into opportunities in the Wisconsin Rapids Mill, and again, Consolidated in general. It gave me an opportunity to understand their perspectives, their needs, from an employee, and also gave me some interviewing skills that I hadn't, had the opportunity. So I moved from the union or the production line to quality systems. I got hired as a management as a technician. Worked in the quality systems program for about 2.5 years. I went off to that was during the time of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and I did not deploy at that time. But obviously I was very interested in what was going on. I had left again for some additional training down at Fort Sill. And shortly after I returned, I had the opportunity, as they were getting ready to build 16 paper machine. And I had the beautiful opportunity to take over for Mr. Pete Mason at the time. Pete was the environmental supervisor for the Wisconsin Rapids Mill and the base or the facilities located in the Rapids area. I knew Roy Schultz. Obviously he knew me from the interviews that I had done with him, and so I was selected to be essentially an acting environmental supervisor for the Rapids Mill while 16 was being produced or being built. Pete had been assigned over to the stock preparation area and helping in that area, and so that was my first opportunity to really kind of apply my water resources skills. And I did that for the better part of 2 years while the paper machine was that complex was being constructed and then started up to the point where it was, truly operational. Concurrent with that time period, of course, I was still looking for a full-time opportunity because I knew I was ultimately going to be moved back into quality systems when Pete returned to the environmental supervisor position. And as luck would have it, there was a position opened in the utility, as I mentioned earlier, with Consolidated Water Power Company as a resources manager. And so I applied, had the opportunity to interview with both the vice president and the president of that small utility. And we hit it off, and I was selected. And I concluded my career with Consolidated, or Stora Enso and NewPage, in that position. I started as the resources coordinator, ultimately retiring or leaving the company as resources manager. Responsibilities, that utility has 7 hydroelectric dams that it had responsibility for at the time, from Lake Dubay all the way down through Petenwell and Castle Rock, not including the 3 mills in and around Nakusa and Port Edward, or 3 dams. And so I was responsible for all of the compliance with the federal licenses. And so it matched very well with my water resources background. I got an opportunity to work in a number of other disciplines that I definitely did not have training in. So I learned a lot of skills, but I was able to apply my water resources skills in that capacity. So
while all this is taking place, you're still in the Guards.
I am. I continued to serve in the military. It's kind of interesting little story. So when I did join, my fiance, my wife now, wasn't exactly excited about me staying in the military for a long period, and so I promised her. I told her, I said I was only going to stay in for my 6-year enlistment, and so that 6 years, as I got closer and closer, of course I had now transitioned it to a commissioned officer. I had gone off to my training and was really receiving some quality training, getting some great opportunities to lead some fantastic troops, and 6 years came and went, and I just kind of kept on going. And so my early career in the military was definitely with the 120th. I had the opportunity. I commanded the unit up in Stevens Point, Charlie Battery, which was where it was located at that time. Came back to the battalion and functioned as an intelligence officer, a fire direction officer. Ultimately had the opportunity to become the operations officer. I was promoted to major. Became what they call the brigade fire support officer. So my responsibilities were to coordinate all of the artillery and any other indirect fires. Could have been from naval gunfire to dropping bombs, you name it. What we'd call it close air support, with the infantry brigade that we were connected to, and that was the 32nd Infantry Brigade. So I had assignments that connected me with the 120th in those later years, but required me. I wasn't physically drilling or located here in Wisconsin Rapids. Ultimately, I was afforded the opportunity to command the battalion, and it really kind of came out of the blue. I was at work doing my job, with Consolidated, and out of the blue, I get a phone call from our brigade commander at that time, just saying, "Hey, Mark, got a great opportunity for you. You're taking command of the battalion next month, and we're going to promote you to lieutenant colonel." So it was a great experience or opportunity for me, and that lasted for a little over 2 years before I was selected for another assignment down in Milwaukee, but it was some of the best years I had.
Battalion, about how many people is that?
At that time, it was about 450 soldiers. So it was, we had 4 batteries. So we had the headquarters and headquarters battery located here in Wisconsin Rapids. Service battery, I should say 5 batteries. Service battery was also located here in Wisconsin Rapids. And then we had Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie batteries between Marshfield, Clintonville, and Stevens Point. And those 3 units were what we called our line companies. So they had the actual howitzers that did the firing.
So you're still with Consolidated?
I was still, yeah.
And doing this?
Still with Consolidated. I was again very lucky that I had a tremendous amount of support from Consolidated Papers, my employers, my immediate supervisors. They understood the value of service. They also, I think, understood the intangible skills that I was acquiring by my service in the military and my experiences and the training I was receiving, and obviously being able to carry that into my civilian job. And so they supported me each and every time that I had to, take off for annual training. There were, we responded to the tornado when it hit Watoma, and I was part of that response. And so, literally overnight, we get the call, and we were gone to go down to Watoma. And each and every time, the company was supportive of it. And so I had a parallel careers going on between my civilian job and my military career. That's really the beauty of being a National Guardsman, because you can do both, and you can be professional at both. You can be very good at both, and you can have success, in both areas. And they really kind of complemented each other, especially in my case.
So National Guard is under the direction of the governor.
Correct. It's a unique organization in the sense of, we are founded in the Constitution. The National Guard is unique of any other service. So we actually have a dual mission. During our normal day-to-day operations, we answer directly to the governor. And only in instances when we are federalized for an overseas mission or for some other purpose outside of what people would maybe consider normal with National Guard duties, domestic response, those types of things. So when we're federalized under the presidential orders, then we fall under the command and control of the president, no different than active duty forces. So we train normally on a day-to-day basis for our federal mission, but understanding that we also have that domestic response that we are responsible to, and we're solely responsible for that. We are the the first military response to any sort of domestic incident.
Okay, so when did you finally give up your civilian job to go full-time in the military?
Oh boy, well that was, it was actually in early 2008. So fast forward to, I had been promoted to colonel and had gone, I was the deputy commander and then of the 32nd Infantry Brigade. I had an opportunity to deploy in 2005, 2006, and when I came back I was assigned as the commander of the 32nd Infantry Brigade. And that's when I was promoted to Brigadier General. But then an opportunity was afforded to me again. The Deputy Adjutant General position, the one that I currently reside in, came open. The general officer that was in it was retiring, and so I applied and was selected. And that was in February of 2007, or 2008, excuse me.
Okay, you mentioned you got deployed.
Correct.
Iraqi Freedom.
Yes.
Okay, 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you assigned at that time, and what were your responsibilities when you went over?
Okay. That's actually a pretty interesting story. So I was like I mentioned, I was the deputy commander for the 32nd Infantry Brigade at that point. And we had a couple of our battalions were getting ready to deploy, and the brigade headquarters was also getting ready to deploy, and I was going to go on that deployment. So we are literally about 30 days away from the headquarters mobilizing to begin its training before going overseas, and we come up onto a secure video teleconference with our future commanding general that was going to be in theater with us. And I was going to be what they called the Chief of Operations, or the CHOPS. As it turned out, my data rank as a colonel was senior to this commanding general's colonel, who was going to be the Chief of Staff. And so the commanding general did not like the fact that I was senior in data rank. And so literally at the end of that secure video conference, he goes, "Who's this Colonel Anderson?" I raised my hand and speak up, and he goes, "Anderson, you're senior to my Chief of Staff." He says, "I can't have that. You're off." And like that, I was no longer deploying with the 32nd Brigade headquarters. So of course I was pretty depressed because I really wanted to go overseas and serve. And so I literally walked down to our Deputy Adjutant General at that time, General Denson, explained the situation and my interest of wanting to deploy. To his credit, he talked to National Guard Bureau, and there were a number of instances or opportunities that were being presented for individual officers or soldiers to deploy as individuals and augment or in whatever capacity the military needed. And that's how I ended up ultimately going. About 3 days after that conversation, I had mobilization orders, and I was shipping or going down to Fort Carson, Colorado, for about 15 days of training only before shipping overseas. If you recall, back in that time, 2005 was when the United States was just starting to build those advisory teams that were helping to build the new Iraqi army, rebuild infrastructure, and those types of missions. So there was just a ton of different areas that the advisors were focusing on. And that's ultimately the mission I've got. And so I go to Fort Carson. I'm literally only there for about 15 days. And they put myself and 16 other soldiers in a very similar situation. We get on a C-17 and we fly into theater. I'm ultimately assigned a team where the responsibility was I was to recruit, train, and then deploy Iraqi soldiers into the fight. In addition to rebuilding the base the Iraqi base that we were living on, and also mentoring the Iraqi leadership that was on that base at the time. So I was kind of triple-hatted in many respects. Extremely frustrating, but very challenging, ultimately very rewarding. So when I started in a little base called the Numanaya. So a lot of people probably would not know that name. But if you think of where Baghdad is, I was about 100 kilometers due south of Baghdad. At that time, a fairly quiet area. We had some small arms fire, not a lot of IEDs. There were some out there, but I was lucky I did not encounter any of those. I was at a Numanaya, and we were being very successful in what we were doing. We had trained over 20,000 soldiers and gotten them into the fight. We had gotten the base reconstructed to the point of self-sufficiency, and that the Iraqi colonel that I was advising was becoming more self-sufficient himself. So as it turned out, I came home on my mid-tour leave, and which was about 7 months into the year-long deployment. And I get an email out of the blue from my commanding general in Iraq that I opened up two days before heading back overseas, and essentially saying, "Mark, when you come back to Iraq, pack your stuff. We're sending you to Habaniya." And again, folks may not know where that is, but Habaniya was, again, another small Iraqi base, but it was located over in Anbar province, right between Ramadi and Fallujah. Extremely dangerous area, kind of dicey. And I remember having a conversation with my wife at the time, should we tell the family? And we both decided not to tell them where I was going until I had gotten back into Iraq and actually had physically moved. And so once I got into Iraq, I had the exact same, to Habaniya, I had the exact same responsibilities for training and building new recruits and then getting them into the fight, reconstructing that base because there was nothing there, and mentoring the Iraqi colonel that was going to be the base commander. Of course, Habaniya in Anbar province at that time, extremely dangerous. We were in firefights almost every day, and so it was a 180 degrees different environment that I was operating in from what I experienced at Numanaya.
So when you're in that Anbar province and things are so dicey, but yet you have Iraqi troops, and there are so many stories back here in the States about Iraqi troops not showing their loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Have any issues like that arise with your command?
I did not directly. We had some with some of the recruits that we had. You have to realize where we were at, it was predominantly Sunni, and a lot of the recruits, we were not being successful in recruiting Sunni Iraqis to join the military. We were getting mostly Shia that were from the Baghdad and southern Baghdad area to join. And so we had Shia soldiers that were training at Habaniya with us. And unbeknownst to them, their leadership had decided when they graduated from basic training, they were going to be pushed into the fight in Anbar province. And so they were going to have to fight alongside other Sunni or Sunni soldiers. Sunnis and Shias don't necessarily get along. And so there was, no sooner did they graduate their basic training, and they had a mini rebellion and refused to deploy. And so we essentially had to, we had to recover all the gear from them, and essentially, took them back over to Baghdad, and just got rid of them, and just started over with training Sunni soldiers or new recruits, and that seemed to work out a lot better. But my personal experience is I never had anything like that.
Okay, because what's going on over there, and you're trying to teach these.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a lot of translators assigned to your unit? Because the language barrier was a big difference.
Oh yeah, salam alaikum. I did. I had translators attached to me, and so I had about 8 of them that would work with me on a day-to-day basis, or my team members, and so you'd start to learn. You'd learn some small phrases that you could discuss with your Iraqi counterparts, but you were very reliant upon those interpreters, and so you really had to develop a relationship with those guys to make sure that you could trust what you were telling the Iraqi commanders, or in the mentoring, that they were communicating it properly to that Iraqi commander. And then in reverse, whatever any feedback that Iraqi commander was providing, that translator could give me the correct information. Sometimes word-for-word translation doesn't work very well, and so they have to paraphrase. And so I would have to work with our interpreters a lot of times in the evening, especially if I was going to have what I would consider maybe a difficult conversation with that Iraqi colonel the next day. I wanted to make sure that my interpreter understood what I was trying to achieve, so that if there were instances where verbatim translation didn't work, that he could paraphrase it, understanding what I wanted to achieve. And so it ultimately worked out very well. And a number of those translators, I've helped 3 of them immigrate to the United States. Phenomenal men. One is located in Michigan. Another one is down in Arizona. The third one is he ultimately moved to Wyoming, went to the University of Wyoming, got a bachelor's degree, moved to Washington, D.C., and attended Georgetown, and just received his bachelor's degree, and actually I just got an invitation. He's getting married. And so he's a great young man, and he was a pleasure to work with. And so I'm hoping that I get a chance to get out there for his wedding.
So how long did you spend over in the Iraq or Middle East area?
I was over there for a little over 12 months in total. I deployed like I said, in July of 2005, and I returned again in July of 2006. So a total of 12 months. I really had an opportunity, as an advisor, I really had an opportunity to really get around the entire country. When I first got into theater, I went up to Baghdad to meet with my commanding general, and the timing of who I was replacing down at Anumanaya, that first base I was at, it wasn't working out exactly. I was about 3 weeks too early into Iraq. So the general looked me in the eye and he says, "Well, Mark," he says, "pack your rucksack," and he says, jump on a helicopter, and he says, "I want you to go to the various training bases that we've got around Iraq, and to gain a perspective of how those commanders are doing the job that he wanted me to do." And so I had 3 weeks that I essentially just I lived out of a little rucksack, and jump on a helicopter to get to whichever location I needed to go to. And of course, those commanders knew I was coming, and then spend 3 days, 5 days with them, fly back to Baghdad, repack my gear, and go back out. So I often referred to that as my magical mystery tour of Iraq. But I got a chance to, I was up towards the Syrian border, Iranian border, Turkey, all the way down to southern Iraq near Kuwait. So I really had the opportunity to kind of span the entire country over the course of that 3 weeks.
Okay, you're an officer in Iraq. What was your everyday life like? We'll do the two different bases.
Sure. Both bases were quite similar with what I would refer to as my battle rhythm. Normally I was up a little after 4 in the morning, and because I needed to get the reports from any of the activities, any enemy activity outside our base during the evening, or if we had an operation that was going on, to get updated on that information. Try to get breakfast in very quickly before seeking out the base commander, the Iraqi base commander. And I would sit in on his staff meeting as he was attempting, to navigate the waters of base command. And even though he technically was not the commander yet, we had not turned over the base to him yet. That was my responsibility. But I would mentor him on how he was interacting with his staff, discussing some of the decisions he had to make or how he was making those decisions. And that would usually carry me, through lunch. And in the afternoon, I would spend time with him and or his subordinates in looking at the various elements of the base itself, whether it was in the training of the new recruits. There was a lot of construction that we were doing. I mentioned we were rebuilding those bases, often responding to, especially latter when I was in Habbaniyah, responding to enemy attacks. And that would, again, take me usually until about 2,200 hours, so 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, for civilian terms, and repeat over each and every day. It was, there was no break. We would take a half a day off. I would split my team. I had 16 soldiers with me. Soldiers, airmen, Marines, and Navy personnel were under me. So I would split the team on Fridays, which was their religious their Sunday. And so it would be a little less busy for us. I'd split the team, allow half the team off in the morning, the other half off in the afternoon to do, whatever they wanted, just to relax, if they needed to do, washing their clothes, whatever it might be. But that was really the battle rhythm that we had. As an officer, I didn't take any special privileges because we were such a small team that everybody had to endure the exact same hardships. We were on Iraqi base. We didn't eat any U.S. or any Russian food or Western food. Everything was, it was lamb and rice and carp predominantly for 12 months. Great weight loss program. So you got a chance to really be embedded with the Iraqis, understand their culture. I celebrated Ramadan with them just so I could understand it. One of the early things that the U.S. Army in its infinite wisdom, as we were getting ready to, I'm going back to before I actually deployed into theater, the guidance they gave us was don't talk about family, don't talk about religion, and don't talk about politics. And so I get into Iraq, I get into my first base at a Numaniyah, and those are the very first things they wanted to know. And so I tried to shy away from initially, but really came to a realization that they were just as interested in to know what my life was like as I wanted to, or in my culture, as I wanted to know about theirs. And so at that point forward, I threw out the book and we just started talking back and forth. And so they understood my religion, my backgrounds, my feelings, showed them pictures of the family. So they knew what my wife looked like and the kids, and they did the same with me. And so we developed a very close relationship in that regard, which I think really helped when it came to developing a level of trust between that Iraqi colonel and myself.
What were your living conditions like? I've heard so much talk about sand and heat.
Both. A lot of sand and a lot of heat. Again, my living conditions were no different than my soldiers. We had some access to air-conditioned areas where we were at, but by and large, everything was not air-conditioned. Normal daytime temperatures, depending upon where you were in Iraq again, and throughout the year it would vary a little bit. But normal daytime temperatures would get as close to 115, 120 sometimes, and the evening temperatures maybe as cool as 60, depending upon where you were in the desert, because the desert can get extremely hot. A lot of extremes, and then of course the sand you have to deal with. There was always some wind blowing, so sand would find its way into everything that you had. So you really had to pay attention to making sure your weapons were clean. I would literally clean both my 9mm, my sidearm, and my assault rifle on a daily basis. That was part of my normal process in the evening, just before laying down. And because obviously those were my last resorts for survival if I got into a situation like that. And I obviously wanted to make sure those worked. So, but those in addition to all the other equipment, sand everywhere. And there were months later, when I was back in Wisconsin, and I'd still find sand, in various pieces of clothing or articles that I had brought home, that the sand had gotten embedded in, and just never got it out.
Contact with home, internet, cell phones.
No cell phones. Back in those, at that time during the war, the cell coverage was not existent. It is now, but it was not existent back then. So I had, the only phone connectivity I had with my wife early on was if I had access to what we would call a morale welfare recreation site, a MWR site, that had a phone service that was supported by the government, by the U.S. military. So my communications with my wife telephonically was very sparse to start with. I'll say maybe once every couple of weeks at most. The internet, again, it was still sporadic, and the connectivity again was not very good. But we were able to communicate at least probably a couple times a week. I discovered at that time a little known program, at least back then, it's very familiar now, called Skype. Had no idea what that was. And I remember I could buy 100 minutes for 10 euros. And so I did that. And when we were out on one of our patrols, we had stopped at a U.S. base and at the little PX they had, and I was able to acquire a little headset with a mic, and I'd plug that into the computer, and I would be able to dial up and talk to my wife or my family through my computer, through the internet. The challenge was just because again, that connectivity was so slow, there was a lot of lag time between phone call or between the discussion. So we'd have to go back to radio procedures and say over, or really have a good long pause. Otherwise you'd step on the other person. As we progressed into 2006, that connectivity got a little bit better. And I actually got access to a satellite phone that one of the local VFW posts here in Wisconsin offered to me. So they had bought a satellite phone, they had bought the minutes, and they shipped it to me. And so I was able to make some phone calls to my wife that way. In fact, very interesting, when I was in Habanilla, we had, there was a particularly good insurgent who was a sniper, and we lost a few soldiers that way. And so we always had to be very sensitive to obviously exposing ourselves. And but to talk to my wife, I'd have to get out onto the roof. And so I'd be crawling out on the roof under a little bit of a parapet and lay in there so I could talk to my wife for a few minutes. And hoping to God that somebody didn't try taking a shot at me while I was talking to her, because I wouldn't have wanted her to hear that stuff.
Exactly. And then other people in your unit, what do you remember about them?
Oh, dedicated professionals. They were, each and every one of them, and not a single one from Wisconsin, none from the National Guard at the time. I had soldiers from South Carolina, North Carolina, Washington, D.C. area, out to Washington State, California, reserve soldiers. I had active duty Marines, active duty Air Force, and active duty Navy in various capacities. Each person was on our team or my team for a specific skill. I had one person that was very good at networks, at computers. And so that's all he did for me. I had other folks that were very adept at logistics, and so I used them to help manage the efforts in refitting the Iraqi army with new equipment, new uniforms, those types of things. My Navy personnel, I had a Navy corpsman. Of course, anybody that's ever deployed appreciates the value of having, a medic along with you. I didn't have an Army medic, I had a Navy corpsman. And it doesn't matter, their skills were exactly the same, and we used them way too many times. And I had another Navy personnel that was an engineering background. And so he headed up our base reconstruction. And then I had other folks that, administrative, some of those things. I had a small security detachment for when we moved, because we had to self-secure ourselves. And of course, susceptible to any of the other dangers that were out there on the road. I benefited when I was in Habbaniyah. We worked alongside the Marines because they had Anbar province, and so we worked hand in hand with them, and we did missions inside of Ramadi, inside of Fallujah, and those two cities were interesting experiences, to say the least.
You talk about use of the corpsman. Any injuries in your units or fatalities?
Thankfully, none of my direct reports, no injuries from them. We did lose a few soldiers of adjacent advisory teams that were killed in action. Of course, a number of the Marines. I did lose a number of Iraqi soldiers at both bases. And, as you were training them, you got to know the small unit leadership pretty good. And so as they went out on combat operations, we were in an advisory role, and we had a couple of units that got hit pretty hard. We had one in particular, we lost 19 guys in one day.
So advisory, when you go out with them on the missions, on the patrols and stuff, you were armed as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So you're not just pointing and say, do this, do this, do this.
No. So I promised my wife when I went over there, if you remember, that there were some fairly graphic videos of beheadings. That was a common activity that was occurring, and I promised my wife, that I would never become a video. And so, every time we were out, of course, I carried my standard 9mm sidearm and an assault rifle. I carried a second pistol in the small of my back because very often we would get into, when I was out and about with the civilian population, because one of the other areas I needed to really focus on was the security of the surrounding area. And the only way you could really achieve that is you needed to get out with the local elders and have discussions with them, eat dinner with them, build those relationships. And so when I did that, I would purposely take all of my gear off so that I was showing some respect in their house. But I kept the pistol in the small of my back. They didn't know it. And then of course, frag grenades. So I used to tell my wife, with all the equipment I was carrying, our basic load of ammunition, both 5.56 for the assault rifle, 9mm rounds for the pistol, a couple of frag grenades, water, plus our SAPI plates. It had about 85 pounds, hanging on me each and every day when we were out. So that takes a toll on the body after a while.
Did you receive any correspondence or packages or anything from people other than your family, showing the support of the people back in the States?
I did. It was absolutely amazing what the American public provided, would send overseas. And I knew full well that, there was obviously some, growing discontent over whether we should have been in Iraq or not in Iraq, or the way things were progressing or not progressing. But never was that, if somebody was against the conflict, against the war, never was that directed towards a soldier, at least not in my experience. And so we would receive packages out of the blue of, toiletry items or just snacks, beef jerky, coffee grounds and the like that we would share among the team members, almost to the point you'd have so much that you'd start stockpiling it. And we literally would have a room probably half the size of where we're sitting today, with shelving that was just stockpiled with, a number of items. And if you needed something, you'd just go in there and grab it. And so the outpouring of support from the public, the American public, was tremendous. One example, but this is part of my family helped with this too. We were out on a patrol and we came upon a very young boy. He was probably about 8 years old. Of course, very rural, very poor. And they had been scavenging in the local dump. And he was barefooted. And he must have fallen on something, because he literally ripped open the side of his right leg. He probably had about a 6-inch gash. And it was bleeding fairly good. Thankfully, it had not hit an artery. But so I grabbed our corpsman and we treated him, working with our interpreter and his parents. Gave them some antibiotics for fear of the infection, and sent them on their way. Coming back, I happened to be talking to my wife Barb that evening, and I related to her this story, and she came up with the idea, well, it'd be great if we could get some shoes to you. And so herself, along with my sister and other family members, ultimately friends from Consolidated, started gathering shoes. And if my recollection serves me right, they sent me 600 pairs of shoes.
Wow. And
Consolidated paid for everything. They boxed them up. They paid for the shipping. And so right around Christmas, along with various small packages of Christmas items coming our way, Christmas cookies, the standard stuff that any soldier appreciates, along comes, if I remember it was 40 or 50 boxes, large boxes of shoes. And so every time we went out to the small communities, we'd take some of these boxes of shoes, and we'd pull those out, and the children would just come out of the woodwork. And we'd be trying to size them as best we could and give them, because really none of them had shoes. They were in such a poor condition, or poor areas. So that was something where we were able to give back to the communities over there, or the people, but indirectly through friends and family that we had here in Wisconsin.
That was really nice. USO show, were you able to take one in at all?
Never was. I've been being on an Iraqi base. Did not have access to them. Those types of activities did not come to where we were at because of the danger element of it. The closest I got was I think I missed the Charlie Daniels band one time by about 3 days. I had to fly up to Baghdad for a commander's call, and he had flown in, and he was going to tour at a couple of the larger bases we had over there, and do some programs, and I just missed it. So no such luck there.
Good memories.
Yeah, a lot of great memories. The shoes I think is one classic one. It's interesting where you will run into people. So I had a good friend of mine, a grade school classmate, Bill Taylor. He graduated from Assumption along with me, and we kind of parted ways, obviously. And lo and behold, I find out he was in Iraq at the same time I was. He was with the Texas National Guard. And so I found his email, I dropped him a note, and he was based up in Baghdad. He was on one of the large U.S. bases. And as fate would have it, I was going up for a commander's call about 2 weeks later. And so I flew up a day early, and I was able to hook up with him. And we hadn't seen each other since high school, so it had been over 20 years.
Wow.
And I ran into a classmate of mine, and we had dinner together and just kind of relived some great memories. But a lot of tremendous experiences. It was such a growth opportunity for me, to be honest, that I was happy to have gotten the opportunity. I would have happily gone back. My wife was not real happy when she heard me voice that. I did have the chance. I went back 3 other times to visiting troops, but never another deployment like that.
Okay, so you're Deputy Adjutant General, Army in Wisconsin.
Correct.
What is that?
Well, it's a big title to start with. So our Adjutant General, 2-star, general officer, is the governor's military advisor. He also has responsibilities for the emergency management at the state level. It falls under the Department of Military Affairs, and he is the head of that. And then he is also the governor's Homeland Security advisor. So immediately under the adjutant general, he has two deputies, two one-star general officers, an Army general officer and an air. I'm the Army general officer. And so indirectly, if the adjutant general is out of the state or unavailable, one of the two deputies fills in as that military advisor to the governor and takes on that role. But otherwise, from a day-to-day perspective, I'm responsible for the operations, the readiness, and the training of the Wisconsin Army National Guard. We have a Wisconsin Army National Guard and a Wisconsin Air National Guard. I have the Army piece. We're the largest element. We're about 7,500 soldiers spread across the entire state. 4 brigade level commands that are the commanders that answer to me, and again, all the soldiers, and a wide range of capabilities. So I handle the day-to-day operations. You could say I'm the operational commander, although I don't have that title as a commander in my on my PD, if you want to call it.
Okay, as a brigadier general, you were promoted through the federal chain of command.
Correct.
How did that all occur?
Oh boy, it's a very complex process. So it starts with being nominated here at the state, and your packet goes through what's called a federal recognition board. So it's kind of like the first hurdle to make sure that you meet the minimum standards required to become a general officer. From there, it goes into the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, and through a host of offices. I wouldn't even want to try to start, but essentially, they are vetting you to make sure that from a performance and potential perspective, that you demonstrate the characteristics and the qualities necessary to become a general officer. If you make it through all of that, your name, along with any of the other officers being considered at that point, it only happens once a year. That group of officers is then submitted to the president for consideration. It goes through the various offices within the White House, and ultimately the president nominates you, or nominates that list of which you're on, to the Senate. And the Senate has to confirm you, no different than, say, confirming a new cabinet member for the president or somebody from the Supreme Court, of such. The same process occurs. You get that Senate confirmation, and when that occurs, your name goes back into that system again. One more vetting to make sure that over the 12 months that it takes for the process to occur, that something negative, has not happened in your career, or that the individual hasn't done something negative. If everything is good, then a federal recognition is provided, and you're promoted to that rank. In this case, for myself, Brigadier General. It was something I never expected. I told you when I first joined, I'd only planned for 6 years, and so in a few short weeks here, I will be starting my 34th year of service, and it's never in my wildest dreams that I think I was ever going to become a general officer. It's not something I aspired to. To be quite honest, as I became an officer, the only thing I really aspired to do was to serve my soldiers, take care of them, train them, make sure they're equipped properly, and prepared to do whatever mission it is. I still take that attitude, or that approach. I try to remain as humble as I can, and that can be difficult some days, because you have people that are there to take care of you and make sure that I get in the right place at the right time, or whatever activity I'm involved in. And so it can be sometimes hard to make sure that you stay grounded. My wife helps me there. But again, it was nothing that I really thought I was going to achieve. And so when it did occur, it was, aside from it being exciting, it was really humbling.
future career plans?
Oh boy. I really don't know. I've got about 6 years that I can continue to serve yet. Of course, as an officer in particular, I serve at the pleasure of the governor and the pleasure of our adjutant general. So I would love to have the opportunity to serve, beyond my capacity right now. And if I'm afforded that opportunity, obviously, I will do my darndest, to do my best job. If I'm not, then I'm probably just, I'll be retiring from the military and probably taking back up golfing and fishing and doing some of the things that I don't get the chance to do very often right now, and spend more time with my family, obviously.
Anything else you want to talk about that we didn't discuss today?
Yeah, I want to thank you for your service, obviously. Today is a special day with Pearl Harbor Day. And, there are so many men and women in this country that have, at some point in their lives, they raised their right hand and swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's a huge commitment on the part of an individual. And so I don't think there's never enough times to say thank you to a fellow veteran or to a veteran for what he or she did. Because, every experience is unique. No one is the same. But everybody joins, I think, with a very common interest, and that's to serve, a selfless service, because, the beauty of military service is that it's not about the individual. It's about the organization. And when you're focused on a mission and you're working as a team, you can accomplish a lot of great things. And I don't think there's many other organizations that can lay a claim to that. And that's pretty unique to the military. And of course, we have a no-fail mission. If something bad happens and we are not prepared to respond, drastic effects can occur, and people can die. And so it's a very serious business. And so we take what we do very serious. But we also recognize that, first and foremost, we're subordinate to our civilian authorities. We answer what they want us to do. And when asked, we provide the best military advice. But at the end of the day, it's the citizens of this great country and that continue to allow us to do what we do. And so for that, I'm truly grateful.
Jim Anderson, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for yours.
Thank you.